Tell no lies, claim no easy victories. I'd like to thank Junius Williams, of course, and the entire committee that helped put this together. This commemoration is incredibly important for us all, and obviously I'd like to thank all of the folks that are in the audience that was there at that time, that risked their lives, their family, their community, for our present and our future. I'd like to thank the shepherd of this house, Reverend Dr. Perry Simmons, who who preached his last sermon on Sunday here, who has been a staple crop in this community for over 30 years, shepherding this community. And obviously, the Reverend Stephanie Minity and the Jubilation Choir for raising the roof off the place. We appreciate you, not in spirit and in song. And I'd like to obviously recognize Councilman Gonzalez, who's here, the president of the Municipal Council, Mildred Crump, is here, and as was stated earlier, the next governor of the state of New Jersey, Phil Murphy. But I just like to say, tell no lies, claim no easy victories. Amilcar Cabral, tell no lies, claim no easy victories. I was born in April of 1969, a year after Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. 3 years after Malcolm X's chest was blown open in Harlem and Medgar Evers gunned down in his wife's arms while his children looked on. I was just a newborn baby when Kim Gibson became the first African-American mayor of a major city along the eastern seaboard. I was not yet born when Newark went up in smoke, and earlier Harlem and Jersey City and Watts and Detroit. Some cities went up more than once, even Plainfield. I was not around then, but I still feel the heat from those fires burning in cities across America and the remnants of unanswered questions, dreams deferred, and a deep, malignant tumor of inequality still lingering like a heavy odor. We treat what happened in our city and many cities in America with a mix of intrigue and romanticism, never the danger and horror that it really represented or the systemic and constant beatdown of a people that exploded almost scientifically in front of one of the worst precincts in the city, across from an American experiment known as Hayes Homes Projects, where poverty was concentrated, where people in the Central Ward were being force-fed a daily dose of urban renewal. I was watching a sitcom with my daughters, and there was this character. I'm guessing she was supposed to be a liberal, progressive teacher in an average American suburban classroom. And she began her lesson by saying to the students, I want to talk about the civil rights movement. And went on to say how exciting the times were then. It was rather disturbing to me to hear, because I thought for a minute maybe I was overreacting, but it represented something different for me. It reminded me that Medgar Evers was killed on his own lawn, that Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney was killed, and Viola Luizzo shot on her way home from a march, and Jimmy Lee Jackson shot to death, and Emmett Till beaten, shot, and thrown in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. James Meredith shot in the middle of his march against fear. Both Kennedys murdered, King stabbed in his chest and later killed on a hotel balcony. Malcolm X shot down at the Audubon Ballroom. Fred Hampton murdered in his sleep next to his pregnant wife. 26 people were killed in the Newark Rebellion. Tanks rolled up and down major streets, and my father was beaten by the police by one of his own classmates and chained to a wheelchair in a hospital. My brother was just born a month before, and my mother had no idea where my father was. She had to call some of his artist friends outside of the city to learn of his whereabouts, to find him bleeding from his head in a hospital. He was later convicted in a court for inciting this rebellion, not poverty, not police brutality, not lack of housing, or any of the things pointed out in the Kerner Commission report. Just him and his poems, which they read in court as proof of his nefarious activity. These were dangerous and ugly times, not really anything exciting here. This is why it always bothers me to see people putting children out in front of them with no information and no consciousness, really, when we romanticize or make our protest a vocation. But I understand that we lack clarity because we have never really been honest and analytical and open and had open discussions with each other or our children about about what actually happened then and how and why Newark burned in 1967. Nor have we reconciled our emotions or dealt with the errors made in those times or faced off with the conditions that still exist today. We have become content with blaming each other and destroying each other for not being able to eradicate these economic and social conditions that have plagued our communities like Newark since the end of the Second World War. Nor have we come to grips with the idea that our reforms have not worked and that we have been organizing people around symptoms and not the root cause of these problems. So we find ourselves repeating the same old refrains. We have not faced the problems head on and have not been creative about how we organize our way out of this. And more importantly, have not told our children the entire truth. So they use social media to destroy each other, not poverty. They attack each other, not racism. They beat each other down, not inequality. In fact, a few days ago, people marched in front of the main precinct demanding that police do something about the murder in their city and not police brutality. Many people are not clear that those fights are actually tied together. When you talk about the quality of policing, or deeper, the idea that we expect the police to address social and economic problems that this country refuses to really address and hasn't done so for decades. In fact, they were used to further those conditions, not repair them. Today, we are attempting to redefine and reimagine what policing looks like in our communities. And our imagination should include the democratization of our economy and the collective responsibility to use our institutions and our city for the well-being of the residents here. The Newark Rebellion wasn't just some emotional response to a rumor, though it was emotional. It wasn't some chaotic activity that people decided to get involved in spontaneously, though spontaneity was involved and chaos ensued. It was not a riot. A riot is what people do after football games and they turn over cars. Riots is what happen when folks take to the streets because their local athletic team lost the game and they stomp and jump on top of police cars and nothing happens to them. Those are riots. Newark, there was a cauldron that boiled over. It was a rebellion. It was this, like in Detroit and Watts and so on, was almost inevitable reaction to not just the conditions that existed in American cities, but it was, as King said, the language of the unheard. And the civil rights movement's inability to address the kind of systemic racism, violence, and saturation of poverty that northern cities were organized with. And though we are 50 years from 1967, some of those systems still exist, and worse, have to contend daily with the thinking that brought those systems into fruition, both from likely and unlikely sources. Some people are just trying to help, yet my mother would say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. As I thought about what I would say today and contemplated whether I would be measured or not, I watched a few videos about the race riot, as they called it then, and decided what I wanted to say that I would say. The only race riots I knew and I learned about in school were the race riots that happened at the beginning of the 20th century, when white people went into our communities and burned them down and lynched people for 100 years. Those were race riots. One video I watched tried to explain the demographics of that time period and how Newark changed and why. They began saying that the residents began getting tired of corruption in Newark and started leaving. What I found ironic is that every instance of corruption they listed showed African-American politicians after 1970. They didn't mention Dutch Schultz or Longie's Wilman, who had a residence at the Riviera Hotel, or his involvement in local politics. They didn't even mention Hugh Adenizio's conviction and others in their relationship to organized crime. Just revisionist history and pictures of black folks doing bad things. Newark was predominantly black in 1966, not 1967, or after the rebellion. So many people obviously began to leave before then. And as more and more people of color migrated into the city, others moved out. And the tax base slowly eroded as a result. Newark was and still is a major industrial city with a very large port, which made it a successful urban economic center and a location for huge shipyards that became increasingly important during World War II. Producing and distributing raw materials for the war hundreds of thousands of African Americans came to Newark looking for work and to escape Jim Crow and terror in the South. During the war effort, it was easier for African Americans to find jobs here, and by 1930, African Americans represented about 9% of the population, which was about almost 40,000 people. And by 1960, we represented 138,000 people. By 1966, African Americans were in the majority. When the war ended, so did those industries and those jobs. After the war, the FHA began to subsidize or provide very low-cost mortgages to families and nearly completely redlining the entire city of Newark, meaning they would not invest in most, if not all, of this city, and promoted the exodus of many families to the suburbs. Then they built interstate roads that ran into the cities that gave folks continued access to the wealth and jobs of the city and the opportunity to leave the city at the same time. And they displaced families of color in the process. This expedited the move outward. Between 1950 and 1967, the white population went from 360,000 to 160,000 before the Newark Rebellion. While the African American population went up to about 220,000 people. And while the federal government subsidized homes in the suburbs for mostly white Americans leaving these cities, they trapped African Americans in a city that was wholly redlined and subsidized with low-income housing that we know as projects. And ironically, some of us are trying to fight to save those buildings today. They concentrated poverty by race in specific areas of the state and city and provided no chance for real upward mobility and social service. In fact, the Hughes Commission that was put together to study the rebellion reported that more than a third of African American men were unemployed between the ages of 16 and 19 and were not enrolled in any school whatsoever. And that in 1966, almost 30% of public housing in the city was classified as substandard or dilapidated in 1966. So you can imagine today, some 50 years later, and some of those buildings are still standing. And some are fighting to keep people in them. A year before the rebellion, when the city had turned majority black, 83% of the police force was white. And 60% of the population was black. The majority of the elected class was white. The leaders in the social service agencies, the schools, the fire department, etc., were all white. It was almost a de facto apartheid structure with a few people of color sprinkled in to represent the majority. So when people say they left the city because of rising crime, corruption, schools, or even rebellion itself, some may be telling the truth, but most left way before that and are revising history. Then this idea of urban renewal came. Urban renewal in 1967 meant the displacement of hundreds of families to allegedly create economic growth without any real community input or legal mechanisms that would ensure that the community would actually benefit. In fact, between 1957 and 1967, there were more than a dozen urban renewal projects in the city, which meant displacing entire communities of black and brown people to put up vacant lots, really, no structures, no buildings, no anything, just vacant lots. And the battle over the development of UMD&J that eventually displaced many residents happened weeks, maybe days before the actual rebellion. There was a community benefits agreement that came out of the UMD&J fight that still has not been fully realized some 50 years later. There are many people that claim that the Newark Rebellion paved the way for more intensity and later even the first black mayor of the city, and I would not completely agree with that, though emotionally and psychologically it may have put a greater sense of urgency on the moment and even inspire a few to get involved in what was already taking place. Before the rebellion, Newark was filled with many organizations. We can't shortchange them. From traditional civil rights organizations to the newer radical groups, a growing cultural nationalist movement, and a national cry for black power. A conference in Newark was actually planned for July before the rebellion took place and still moved forward after people said that it shouldn't, weeks after the last fire stopped burning. There's a picture that I've seen countless times growing up of the Black Power Conference in Newark with my dad sitting with a bandage over his head fresh out of the hospital and jail, and on his left sat Maulana Karenga, and on his right was H. Rat Brown. People from all over the country converged on our city for this historic moment to hold one of the country's first Black Power conferences. And later on, CFUN led by Amiri Baraka, called for a Black and Puerto Rican convention that was convened with Bob Kervin at the helm. Some of the things that they talked about in the Black and Puerto Rican convention, they said that the cost of education and welfare should be completely taken over by the state and the federal government, that the state should pay for education in the city. Reminds me of Abbott versus Byrd. They said that revenue sharing, the federal funding mechanism should give extra consideration to real estate tax overburdened cities like Newark. Schools have to teach Black and Puerto Rican history beginning at the primary level. The school district should be divided into districts with duly elected governing boards. There needs to be more Blacks and Puerto Ricans appointed to the police force, and the police officers should live in the city. The establishment of effective police civilian review board to investigate and hear community complaints concerning police activity. Teachers should live in or have backgrounds related to the community in which they are teaching in. Schools need an all-day program for pre-K and kindergarten children. Free lunches should be given for economically disadvantaged children. All of this sounds familiar. Things that we are still struggling to get today. And soon after Ken Gibson was elected mayor, in a time when the city was not only physically devastated and poverty growing, the tax base bailed and bailing, but he was left with a huge budget deficit and had to lay off at least a third of his workforce. They finally turned the city over, but after almost totally destroying and looting it. That's right. So they show you videos of people looting stores, but the real looting took place with the resources that existed in City Hall. So after they looted every program, every opportunity that we had, and they finally walked out of the city, they turned it over to Ken Gibson, and we beat him up so bad because he could not make a miracle out of what they've done. So what did we learn and what must be done? We certainly have a completely different makeup of the police department today than we did in 1967. We are in the majority now, but we still suffer from systemic patterns and practices that look the other way when our constitutional rights are abridged and when racism rears its ugly head. The voice of the past is still very loud in the FOP through retired cops that harbor the sentiments and narrative of those times. They still are fighting not to live in this city and opposed to real police reform. The good news is that we are presently under a federal consent decree. We have stood up a CCRB, though we are limping along and in court with opposition from the FOP and superior officers. And the African American and Latino cops and officers of good conscience, they need to take the direction of the FOP and the department and lead it toward greater democracy and justice for the residents of this city. We need police officers to suffer consequences for beating and murdering unarmed Black and brown people. We need serious criminal justice reforms that destroy the pipelines to prison, where almost 50% of its population look like me. And we have to attack the narrative that paints us as criminals. Our unemployment rate is still too high, though we have made great strides. We have to support Newark 2020 and aggressively engage the businesses in this community to hire Newark residents and support living wages. You have to demand that they support local businesses here and spend their dollars in our city. The average spend in our city is about 3%. The city has moved our individual spend to 15% locally. We want to continue to increase that, but we have to get others to do the same. We have to support NCLC and continue to create more pipelines from the public schools to the universities in this city. Follow the lead of Dr. Cantor and ensure that our incoming classes are abundant with Newark students. It's counter to the growth of this city to have 50,000 college students and less than 20% of our residents with degrees, and even fewer with advanced degrees. We have to take full control of our school system and begin to focus on relevant and useful curriculum. And while people try to distract you into many different things, we have to focus on relevant and useful curriculum. Again, while many people try to distract us in many different things, we have to focus on relevant and useful curriculum that our children can carry with them outside of the place where they see themselves and where they're empowered to change their environment. We have to support community schools and make sure that it spreads throughout the city and ensure that Abbott is fully funded. We have to teach our children the truth. We have to tell our children the truth. No matter how hard how desperate, how painful, we have to tell them the truth. And allow them to organize, but also analyze. We have to not just force them to march, but force them to read and study what happened. You can't just organize and mobilize without information. No investigation, no right to speak. We have to stop being on the defensive and start moving the ball down the field. We need an offensive play, not just reaction. We need offensive plays. We've been so used to playing the game without the ball that when we get the ball, we don't know what to do with it. Our people deserve to win, not just suffer in principle. We deserve a win, a victory now and again. We don't deserve to die on dirty streets. We don't deserve to sing and languish in jail. We don't want to lose all of the time and talk about how great and romantic it is losing. We want to win. We want to be in the finish line. We want to be at the goal posts. We want to carry the ball all the way around the plate. We want to win, and our children deserve a victory. We have to continue to support the growth of summer youth employment and training. We went from 1,000 to 2,700, but we need to be at least 4,000 to 5,000 children every summer. And we have to continue to make that happen. We have to support and pass inclusionary zoning in the city and a tax abatement policy that forces developers to include local minority contractors and developers. We have to pressure trade unions to become more democratic and train and include more local people of color. We need a housing policy that does not concentrate poverty in one building or in one area of the city. And we need to understand that in order to redistribute wealth, we have to attract it and capture it first. That we cannot be parochial in our view of the city that forces us to see the city from our individual interests as opposed to how we collectively create and force development in every community where all of us live. We have to continue to put pressure on financial institutions to invest in the poorest parts of our city and seize property from these institutions that are creating blight in our neighborhoods through predatory lending and foreclosures. We have to develop cooperative businesses and home ownership and support the city's effort to do so. We can't just be comfortable with renting. I saw a sign, all power to the renters, all power to the people, and the people should own the things that they produce. They should own what they produce, not just lease it or rent it. There are billions of dollars of development happening in our city, and Springfield Avenue is not the same block post-1967, and the downtown community is coming back after most department stores were closed down and left. Most of the tall project buildings have been demolished and turned into scatter site housing, so Hayes Homes and Prince Street no longer stand. We have seized political power in this city, but continue to be marginalized by a narrative of lawlessness and dangerousness in a city with corruption and incompetent leadership that has been put out since we took control. And unfortunately, some of us continue to speak that narrative ourselves. As Carter G. Woodson said, if there's no back door, we create one. And so the news stories are not just responsible for keeping us in this place. Many of us are in collusion with the very news that keep us trotting in place. We have to become sophisticated as the Congress, as my father would say. That is, we have to debate and disagree, but whatever we decide has to become the law. We have to have unity without uniformity, or the ability to disagree and challenge each other without abandoning each other. We can't get ahead on each other's backs. We have to get ahead so we can have each other's backs. Our job is not to beat our brothers. Our job is not to destroy our allies. Our job is not to diminish our help. Because when you destroy the people that are around you, you are alone. And if you are alone, then you are defeated. It is important that we build alliances, not isolate ourselves and destroy alliances. Our struggle for democracy is not finished. Our quest for political and economic power and equity is not finished. Our push to eliminate the conditions that caused 1967 is not over. Our trip to the bank, as King pointed out, still yields us a check marked insufficient funds. We still live in two economies, as the Kerner Commission alluded to and King addressed in his speech at Stanford, one separate and unequal. This means that we have to organize locally, as many of us are doing, and begin to develop local strategies to not just keep our city afloat in a precarious time such as this, but continue to move forward together. And finally, on a national level, we need to call for an urban Marshall Plan. The New Deal missed entire communities. Jim Crow and systemic racism was the rule of the day when the New Deal was here. And as they fixed and repaired war-torn Europe, they created policies that caused deterioration of our cities and deliberately disinvested in our neighborhoods, then blamed us for the failure of its institutions. They took away the property base in the city and told us that the schools were funded by property tax, and then beat us up and took the schools when we had no resources to educate our children in a proper way. And then put us against one another in the street and in public, and then we called for our oppressors to come in and control our destiny in our city. We asked them to come in to take the schools from us. And so now many of the people that called for the state to come in are beside me saying they want them to go. It's always been our house. It's always been our place. If you didn't learn anything from 67, that's what you should have learned, that self-determination is important. And if we make an error, we have the right to make errors. If we make a mistake, we have a right to make mistakes, but we also have a right to fix our errors. We have the right to fix our mistakes. We have the right to elect our own people. We have the right to govern our own businesses. We have the right to open our own stores. We have the right to run our own schools. We have the right to teach our own babies. We have the right to run our own streets, our own households, our own homes. That's what self-determination means. It means forward ever, backwards never. It means forward ever, backwards never. It means that every institution in this city should be controlled by the people who live in this city. That's what it means. And I don't care how many times we mess it up. We have the right to fix it as many times as we mess it up. Yes, we need a huge economic investment in American cities and communities that experience 30 to 40% of poverty and double-digit unemployment for the last 5 decades. Yes, 1967 still exists. The last 5 decades, 30 to 40% poverty, deep unemployment, double digits in most of our cities around America. We need an urban Marshall Plan. We need investment in infrastructure, jobs and training, and hospitals and schools and so on. We need these things, and we need them now. It's the only way to continue to further our quest for democracy and to ensure that 1967 never happens again. I'm not here to just remember what happened in 67. I'm here to prevent 1967 from ever happening again. We don't want to die in the street. I don't romanticize death. We don't want Medgar Evers to be shot on his lawn, or we didn't want Malcolm X to be murdered in the Audubon ballroom. My mother didn't want to run across the street in her nightgown looking for her husband in the middle of this thing. We didn't want this. 26 families have lost their children. We didn't want that. We didn't ask for this. We didn't vote for poverty. We didn't vote for unemployment. We didn't vote for terror in our neighborhoods. We want democracy, and we want it now. The rebellion was because there was no democracy for black and brown people in America in these cities, and we rebelled to scream democracy now, democracy for all of us, or democracy for none of us.